Okay, so hi everyone. I guess it's 20 past, so I will start. My name is Nicolas Fries. I'm working for a company called Implenia. Implenia, for the ones that are not Swiss-based, is a bigger developer and construction company. So we develop, we build, but also we do also asset and portfolio management. So we basically cover the whole life cycle of a building. I myself work for the division real estate, so I'm more active in the development phases 1 to 3 based on SIA, and I'm responsible for the topic of sustainability. So I'm going to talk about sustainability or data-driven sustainability, so more on the question how data or the harness of data can empower our sustainability goals, right? So how can we have an impact by the means of data? I would like to start maybe by looking back a little bit, how sustainability was taught in the past, especially when it comes to reporting. So sustainability is a topic that was said to be more soft, normative, more qualitative, right? It's actually kind of like an intangible, let's say, field in the construction industry. On the other side, when it comes to financial reporting, everyone expects, hard data, descriptive data, quantitative data, and of course, like normed or norm-based or objective data. So that's more or less the old paradigm. When I studied 10 years ago, sustainability was more something you would report, let's say, with pictures and a lot of text. But nowadays, what we perceive from the investor market is more the demand of raw, brute data, respectively indicators. So what we now talk about is more what we call integrated reporting, right, where the financial and the non-financial KPIs are merged. And we have to come up with measurable, norm-based, transparent, and also third-party verified data. So this is a development that is currently taking place in the market. And in my opinion, it's very much driven by this investment spectrum you see on the right side. So when we talk about traditional investment, usually it's an investment that is profit-driven, right? So you want to increase your return on investment. The next step would be ethical screening, where you would screen the market basically and see for potential damages of your business activity and try to avoid them. More along the line, you have so-called ESG investing. There, suddenly it's not about shareholder value, but you accept that you have more than just shareholder. You have your stakeholders, and it's also about them, right? So you try to increase your field of action and try again to avoid harm. Now, nowadays, everyone talks about so-called impact investment. And impact investment is a little bit of a different notion where you say, well, I not just want to do less bad, but I want to create some good. So I'm more solution-oriented and want to bring up specific solutions for problems we have. And on the very right side, you have philanthropy, and philanthropy basically is the same, but philanthropy is not profit-driven, right? So when you do philanthropy, you don't strive for a financial return on investment. And basically, this whole development based on the investor market leads to an increasing need for sustainability data, of course, an increasing need for a well-founded decision with measurable impacts. And that's actually where I'm coming from. So data, non-financial data, are becoming more and more important. I just brought today a little overview about potential sustainability KPIs. So I guess every one of you heard about ESG, so environmental, social, and governance. So this is more, let's say, the company's perspective on potential risks they create. And here you have, on the 3 different levels, lots and lots of indicators. I'm not going to go into detail in all indicators. I think most of these are familiar to you. What is now a little bit more interesting and a little bit newer, I would say, is kind of like this bottom-up perspective when it comes to construction projects or real estate as a general word, right? So here we would less talk about ESG, but more about the 3 spheres of sustainability. So environment, society, and economy. And there we have a lot of new or quite recent KPI that are popping up. For instance, here operational and embodied carbon, so-called Scope 3 emissions. And investor asks developers, but also construction companies more and more to provide these data, right? Because in the end, they have also to fulfill some ESG ratings, for instance, for the companies, so they require these data. What all these data have in common is that it's not about measuring them once in the life cycle of real estate, but we have to measure them at several, let's say, milestones, beginning from land acquisition to pure planning and development in the construction phase, and of course also in the operational phase of a building. And when you talk about circular economy, even in the end-of-life phase of a building, right? So all these data need to be covered during a perspective of maybe 60, 80 to 100 years, right? Basically on the same scale of a building's lifespan. And this causes a lot of, let's say, obstacles in a certain way, and also challenges for the industry. And in this, let's say, field, I'm actually currently working to understand how we can provide a data flow which would cover all life phases of a building, where we don't have interruptions of data, or we don't lose basically these data, in order to be able to provide, let's say, a full picture of real estate to our end clients. Now I've brought a more specific example on one of these indicators. We call it decarbonization. I guess every one of you heard about that topic in real estate. So it's all about reaching net zero and even beyond net zero, so maybe positive or net positive buildings, in the sense that we don't just want to reduce operational emissions, so for instance electricity and fossil fuel-based emissions during the operational phase of a building, but also so-called embodied carbon. In German it would be Erstellungsemissionen, so all the material-induced emissions that are happening as well. What you see here is the traditional SIA process in construction. So on the left side, we start with strategic planning, then we go into preliminary studies, so that it's phase 2. Phase 3, it's about project planning. Then after phase 4 and 5 is the execution, right, which starts with the tendering process, and on the very right you have the operational phase. Now, in terms of CO2, we have a very, let's say, quite complicated data flow actually in place today. So everything would start in the first phase with a site analysis, right? You would actually analyze the site and see what is the potential of the site with respect to exogenous factors. So for instance, solar radiation, right? Or orientation of the building, or potentially also the compactness of the building that you can provide, and see whether, you know, the exogenous factors are favorable or unfavorable to reach a certain carbon target. Beginning of phase 2, we would actually attribute a so-called CO2 budget. So a building or a project receives a certain threshold. Again, not just for operational emissions, but also for embodied carbon. And then usually projects go into the architectural competition, right? So we would invite several teams, and that's actually where it gets tricky, right? Because you invite different architectural and planner teams around the table to provide a certain design. And usually at this stage, the data we get are unstructured, not very specific, but nevertheless, we need to select a project with a certain potential, right? So this is the first, let's say, tricky part in the process. And what we do nowadays is, of course, work with BIM. So BIM, building integrated or building information modeling, and try through IFC exports to come to the data we need to calculate the potential on the level of CO2. We work here, for instance, or we intend to work in the future also with a company called 2050 Materials. I think one representative here is here also at this hackathon. So here it's all about trying to make a prognosis to the future whether the selected design is going to meet our carbon budget. In phase 3, it's all about, let's say, more build-up based selection of MEP systems And there as well, of course, we need to provide the architectural team with the required data and also calculation in order to guide the project in a certain direction, right? So it's not enough just to say, well, I calculate my carbon footprint by the end of the design phase, but I have to do it in recurring times before that to know whether I will be or I will meet my CO2 budget. And here we use a quite known tool called one-click LCA, also based on IFC exports from the BIM model. In the realization phase, and again, it's more about what we call material passports. I'm sure some of you have already heard about the company Medester. So here again, it's a BIM-based evaluation of the materials we have used in the building. You can even go product-based, right? So you maybe shift from a generic material view to a more product-related view, and you deliver a so-called material passport. Why is it relevant? Because more and more clients actually want exactly to know what kind of materials and building products were used in their buildings, because they might want to sell these products and building materials in the future. So again, like, you know, this aspect of circular economy that will come over time. And then in the operational view, it's maybe less about material-induced or embodied carbon, right? Because we already built the building, but it's more about the question of redevelopment planning. So the typical case where we have a certain building, the building is old, and we ask the question, well, what is the best case in terms of CO2? Shall we dismantle the building? Shall we try to refurbish the whole building, and so forth? So here it's, of course, an evaluation of potentials we have for surfaces, for CO2, for profit, of course, as well, in order to guide a certain decision. So here again, the question of CO2 is quite imminent. And to be very frank with you, here we kind of lack an appropriate tool at the moment. A tool that really helps us to come up with a very quick decision, not just based on operational carbon, but also embodied carbon. Operational carbon, I think there are various tools on the market already, but the holy grail in that respect somehow is really the topic of embodied carbon. So then we have another work stream internally that's maybe more the internal view of Implenia. It's what we call the internal reporting. So here is again on different phases in the process we want to report. We want to check whether we fulfill our own targets that we set. And for that we have to work also with Excel-based tools such as the SIA 2040, which is a Swiss-based norm to calculate operational embodied carbon. And we transfer everything in a program which is called Sphera. Before it was called Sophie, so it's maybe also a tool some of you might heard of. Here maybe on the right side, what is quite interesting as well is the topic of real-time energy monitoring. So here it's again more related to operational emissions. So it's the whole topic of like, how can I gather real-time data on the consumption of my building, right? And there again, you have different tools which might also fuel your decision of redevelopment and planning on the very top again, right? But as you see here on this picture, this whole process very fragmented, and unfortunately it gets even more complex when it comes to certifications. There are lots of certifications here in Switzerland, but also in Europe, and all these certifications have a certain methodology to follow when it comes to calculating carbon. And most certification prescribe also the programs we're allowed to use when it comes to calculating a certain value, right? So here again, we have to deviate from, let's say, our internal tool to an external tool, which is called LaserSci. So we have to run the whole calculation again, at least twice, once before the building permit and after construction. So that's what is prescribed by Minagi Eco and SMBS, which are two Swiss-based labels. And then the last layer, rating and benchmarking. Here it's more on the level of a whole portfolio. So often we have clients, institutional clients, and they participate, for instance, to international benchmark analysis like GRESB, sometimes also pronounced. And here again, we have to transfer all these data into another mask into another data structure to provide proof of a certain of the carbon footprint of that building. This you would do typically in the development phase once, and then actually on a recurrent basis every year for the operational phase of the building. And to finish this kind of like picture, to do so, you need also some core data about the building, because as you might know, CO2 is always calculated by dividing, for instance, through the surface of a building. So you need the right surfaces. You need also values in terms of compactness. One big lever is also the glazing ratio and so forth. So you need also the core data that will fuel the whole process on the top. So here again, let's say another type of data that kicks into this process of decarbonization. So I didn't want to make it look too complex, but that's actually the reality today, right? So that's how we would run the process for a new project within Implenia. And as you see, the problem we have is that we have several tools that we apply. We have several interfaces. We have several times also Excel as an intermediary solution to put data from one system to the other. So in the end, it's getting quite messy and complex, right? And another problem we have, of course, and I think that's more related to today's discussion, is the topic of proprietary systems, right? So we have a license to a certain tool, and by doing so, we exclude sometimes also different planners, right, to actually work in that process directly. So I think open source can certainly be a good solution also, or let's say one lever to make it more, let's say, easier and to provide a specific solution, not to exclude any partner within this life cycle of the building. So this as a view of how Implenia runs the topic of decarbonization. Maybe before I conclude here, a building on which we're currently applying this system. Why am I mentioning this building? Because it's actually a building that is going to stand a couple of 100 meters away from here. So here we are in the so-called Sulzer Fabrik, or SLM Fabrik, right? The place where locomotives were built in Switzerland. And we have here a very beautiful project that is currently being developed of a 100-meter tower. And this tower is made out of timber, right? So it's going to hopefully be the highest timber tower worldwide. And the challenge we have is that we have to justify this building to the client, right? So why do we need timber to build it? Because of course we want to reduce the CO2 footprint of our building. How much CO2 do we actually spare by building like that, right? How much is it worth actually to the client to maybe justify an additional investment into planning and also construction, right? So this project basically relies on lots of sustainability data to actually kind of support the business case to a client. That's again like where the financial and the non-financial indicators merge, and that's why I wanted to just mention this project. So maybe to summarize, I think our goal is so-called data-driven sustainability, and that actually depends from our perspective on three layers. We have the layer of data. So here it's all about integrating sustainability data as a basis of decision making. So having really tangible data that will support this process. So it's all about measurements, collection, evaluation, normalization, standardization, so that you can also compare it to other buildings. And then, of course, from an internal perspective, the centralization and the reporting either to our management but also to the client. So this is one layer we have to work on. Then, of course, not to underestimate is the layer of people. When you introduce new tools, new processes, of course, you have to sensitize, you have to train, and you have to incentivize people to apply this system. Not always easy, of course, and this always needs quite a lot of time. And the third layer is more the technology level, and here I hope that setups like this hackathon can bring us forward when it comes to technology that supports this process, so that we have less or fewer interfaces and less individual solutions, that we have actually solutions that would cover the whole life cycle of a building, right? So the differentiation company and project, this view like ESG and sustainability that I showed before, project and portfolio, right? This correlation between the life cycle phases, as I showed before, and also between sustainability topics. What you have seen right now is, for instance, just one glimpse into the topic of decarbonization, but there are way more topics that we have to work on sustainability. So, for instance, the topic of biodiversity, where sometimes you have to show trade-off between one topic and the other. And technology is going to, in my opinion, play a very, very important role when it comes to just try to find the optimal solution in a world that actually has multifaceted. Okay, so I want to conclude my presentation. Maybe a quick little bit of advertisement for a new paper we just provided on the topic of net zero carbon. So it's very much related on the topic I presented. So it's all about the levers we have at hand in the different life cycles to decarbonize the buildings on the level of operational, but of course also embodied carbon. Okay, so we have, I think, a couple of minutes left, maybe for questions.
On the range of 1 to 10, how you would judge Implenia compared to other companies in Switzerland in terms of decarbonization in the real figures?
In the real figures, well, I think, just in Switzerland, it's a difficult one. I would say we're maybe at 7 out of 10, in the sense that we, since like around 5 years, really work hard also on embodied carbon emissions, whereas the market still speaks more or less about operational emissions. So I think we were kind of a little bit forerunners when it comes to really the embodied carbon. We ran a study a couple of years ago really to show the impact, right? Especially for new buildings. It's not really about operational carbon, it's more about embodied carbon. But I still think the problem that we have right now as Implenia is more this data flow, right? Because there are so many actors in the life cycle and so many interruption of the data flow that it's quite hard to make sure that, the data you gathered at the very beginning will be still around in the operational phase of the building, right? So I think there we have a lot of potential to solve, yeah.
Thanks. You just explained the 4 layers of the certification level for the internal communication and the external communication.
Yeah.
My question would be, since the sustainable requirements, regulative costs are getting intense, and on that terms, these 4 layers, would you be able to judge on figures as well, on percentage, how much more expensive the consideration of decarbonization by the regulation costs a building today compared to yesterday?
The cost just of like calculating carbon, or also the cost induced when you would optimize on the level of the building design, construction costs, and so forth?
This decarbonization process as a roadmap is fully completed, means from the design phase to the operation phase.
Yep.
Is it around 50% more cost, higher cost than before, or less?
But what are you looking at, the construction costs or at, let's say, planification costs?
What costs, the administration costs?
I think it's, I can't tell you a number with that respect. The problem, how it's run nowadays, it's more a support function, right? So there is someone part of the planning and also the realization phase that would make sure that data are gathered and calculates the embodied carbon and the operational carbon as a prognosis, right? So it's difficult to measure, but anyway, for when it comes to labels, for instance, we have to do it, right? So there is no, let's say, we don't compare it of not to do it, because we have to somehow, right?
You did not compare in the past, because if you're building only a building for 250 people, students, a student house.
Yep.
Before you pay 11 million Swiss franc, and today you pay maybe 18 million. Then you have no idea how much expensive a building is costing with consideration of the administrative work, is it true?
With the conservation
If you
of?
consider the
Yeah.
additional works
Yeah.
provided to the regulation, European Union and the Swiss government, they co,
Mhm.
and the additional co-works involved in the concept of the economical cycle. You have no idea.
I mean, we couldn't. I can't drop you a number because it's very project related. I mean, there are some projects where it's easier because, as I said before, some project very much, are. I mean, every project is depending also from exogenous factors. So sometimes I have very good requirements to decarbonize, and sometimes it's very hard, right? So that's one problem we have. And the second thing is there is always a client, right? And the client needs to make the business case. And in the end, exactly. And it's not just about costs, it's also about value, right? So, the business case of the client is not just construction costs, it's how much I pay for the land, what is my margin I want to do, what are future profits that I generate, what are the costs on my building. And then, of course, operational carbon normally helps to reduce the costs over the whole life cycle, right? So I can't give you a number, it's impossible, I think. What our evaluators on the market say is that operational carbon today already has a business case because you can reduce your operational costs, and body carbon hasn't yet. But if topics such as CO2 pricing and taxing come, then it will, right? So then all these processes are somehow financially justified to do. At the moment, it's maybe more an ESG target of an institutional investor that will lead that process, right? And less the hard numbers and the business case, yeah. Okay, so maybe one last question because I think we're running out of time. Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I understand it correctly. Often when you build a new development, you need to construct in Switzerland. How systematic are you looking at Kernsanierung versus Ersatzneubau kind of this case? Are you doing that very systematic, or is that what you showed is after the decision we do a new development?
No, so we call it norm strategy, right? So there are different cases. Either you buy a green, like a lot of plan, right? And then it's anyway clear, right? If you have an existing building on the lot, right, you would always try to come up with a certain figure of saying what is, let's say, the CO2 footprint I have in this building, which is not an easy task because there is literally no data about, how much material or how many material, which types have been incorporated in the building. So you would kind of think, well, how old the building is, what are the substance, and then come up with a certain benchmark in terms of embodied carbon, right? Operational carbon is easier because you have the real consumption values of that property usually, so you can say, right? And then you would try to come up with a case. We modernize the building, right? We maybe increase by a certain level, or we build new and deconstruct, right?
And you have to. Before you do the competition, right?
Of course, yeah. That's so before the competition,
yeah. You have ideas on how the new rebuild would look like.
Yeah, exactly.
You are doing that job, or are you working with?
That's part of the developers. No, sometimes you have clients that already did that job, and then they come to us, right? And sometimes it's Implenia that invests, and then we do the job internally. Yeah.
Okay.
But
that's a crucial how you define the new projects.
Of course,
data-driven quality, and then to look if this makes sense or not.
Yeah. And this, what you mentioned, right? You have tools on the market that do it quite thoroughly on the basis of operational emissions, but on the topic of embodied carbon, that's really hard, right? Because first you need to understand what you have in terms of embodied carbon in your current building, and come up with certain benchmark, or maybe make 3D models and so forth. But that's all cost-induced.
If it matters at all, if you have a carbon budget left until 2050, actually I don't care. ASIA doesn't. They have a different
but then I think, well, that's the way we calculate. I agree that doesn't matter, but I think you would always say that material substance has a certain value, right? So it's always about the topic of trying to think, well, that's more circular economy that will kick in there, right? So the avoidance of the use of primary resources and so forth. But yeah. Okay, I think we have to stop. Is there already the next presenter here? Because I have been told that I have to finalize at 40, but otherwise I can take another question. Yeah. So,
Yeah, I just want to ask about the ratio between the embodied CO2 and use operational CO2.
Yeah.
What's the ratio between those two? When you're building for 2 years with a lot of materials, but you're using the building for 50 years.
Yeah. I mean, if you, I mean, for refurbishment project, it's really depending on how much you would deconstruct or destroy, right? This ratio. On new builds, I mean, we have run an assessment of like 36 major development projects, and the distribution is 1/3 operational carbon against 2/3 embodied carbon for a new build, right? So when it comes to decarbonization, you really have to focus on the 2/3 as well. So the 1/3 operational carbon is maybe the lower lever you have on the project. Yeah.
Because mostly when we are doing a new design, new development, there are a lot of simulations for the operations.
Yep.
If you are saying that only 1/3 is for the operation,
Exactly.
so it's for the materials,
Yep.
we should be more focusing on the
Exactly.
Making better materials, easier materials
Yep.
to
For new builds, that's the lever you have in terms of decarbonization. Yeah. The bigger lever, let's say. Yep. Okay. Any other question? Okay. So thank you very much for your attention. Then I would give the stage to the next presenter.